Hello everyone, wherever you are. Welcome to the third session of the online colloquium, Pluralizing the Anthropocene. My name is Gonçalo Santos. I'm a social cultural anthropologist based at the Research Center for Anthropology and Health and the Department of Life Sciences at the University of Coimbra. I'm also director of the International Research Network Sci-Tech Asia. I'd like my colleague Luísa Santos to introduce herself because both of us will be the moderators of this evening's session with anthropologist Agustín Fuentes.
Thank you, Gonçalo. My name is Luísa Santos. I'm a biological anthropologist and paleopathologist at the Department of Life Science and at the Research Center for Anthropology and Health at the University of Coimbra.
And let me greet Agustín. Hi, Agustín. Welcome to Pluralizing the Anthropocene. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited for this.
Okay, let me start by saying a few contextualizing words about this colloquium. Pluralizing the Anthropocene is a project curated by myself and my colleague Luísa Santos, building on a partnership between several institutions representing the sciences, the arts, and the humanities. The Research Center for Anthropology and Health, the Fundação dos Serralves, the Research Network Sci-Tech Asia, the Center for Functional Ecology, Science for People and the Planet, and the Department of Life Sciences at the University of Coimbra. We would like to thank these institutions for making this colloquium possible. Many thanks also to the members of the Serralves technical team for their wonderful support. Serralves is a leading global cultural institution known for its role in promoting public debates on topics that matter to everyone. And I think this colloquium really fits the bill. Public response to the colloquium has been overwhelming. I'd like to tell you that more than 1,700 people registered for this talk, including people with many different professions and from many different countries and continents. I would like to thank everyone for their support. When Luísa and myself started designing this colloquium sometime last year, our goal was to create an open, multivocal, and international forum of debate on important issues that are not getting as much attention as they should. The world's attention, of course, at the moment is rightly focused on tackling a global pandemic that has proved far more deadly than initially predicted. But we also need to think about some of the underlying issues shaping the present epoch of increasing anthropogenic environmental uncertainties, of which the COVID-19 pandemic is only a byproduct. The world we live in is very different from that of our grandparents and great-grandparents. It's warmer, drier, more polluted. And if the trend of ruination continues, it's more than likely that we will compromise the livability of the planet for the future generations. The current production and consumption system has brought many benefits to a large number of people and populations around the world, even if with significant inequalities, but it has also led to unprecedented levels of environmental destruction and to a conjuncture of global warming and climate change with increasingly visible effects. The present decade, the third of the 21st century, will be decisive when it comes to addressing these issues and planning a little bit better the future of our communities. Before we plunge into a conjuncture of chaos, confusion, and rising inequalities, even more disturbing than what we are currently witnessing under the current COVID-19 pandemic. There are, of course, many people who are denying the relevance of many of these concerns, but even these people cannot really ignore ongoing debates on environmental destruction, climate change, and the future of the planet. These are the biggest challenge of the epoch we live in, the Anthropocene, or the age of humans. The term Anthropocene, or age of humans, was coined by the late atmospheric scientist Paul Crutzen in a conference sometime in 2000 to highlight the role of human activities in climate change. The term was then appropriated by geologists to refer to the present geological era as a period in which humans have become one of the most potent geophysical forces in the planet. And their activities are leading to increasing environmental uncertainties. We are now in 2021, and Paul Crutzen died earlier this year in January. And there is still no consensus within the geophysical sciences on the validity of the term Anthropocene, just as there is no consensus on the precise beginning of the Anthropocene as a geological era. But most scholars would agree that the environmental impact of the human planetary expansion has become increasingly visible after the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and in particular after the great global acceleration that took place after World War II. In the last 2 decades, the term Anthropocene has gained increasing popularity beyond the geophysical sciences, entering the humanities, the social sciences, the arts, and the media, and leading to the development of critical alternative terms like Capitalocene and many other, all of which defined in relation to the original concept of the Anthropocene. Whichever way we look at the concept, the Anthropocene has entered global cultural and political imaginaries as some kind of hyper-object or magnet that helps capture the tensions and the dilemmas of the age we live in. An age that is marked by increasing anxieties about the future of human life on the planet. But the Anthropocene is not just about a runaway world of environmental doom. It is also about overcoming disaster and catastrophe and creating new visions of hope and justice. The realities of anthropogenic climate change, species extinction, of which we are going to hear a lot today, and sea level rise, compel a reimagining of humanity's place in the world, and an urgent rethinking of the dominant forces threatening the ecological balance of the planet. A rethinking that must go beyond make-do patchwork interventions like green capitalism and technological solutionism. Using the term Anthropocene to refer to the current age of increasing anthropogenic environmental uncertainties has started new conversations about what needs to be changed in the global economic system. But it has also generated a monolithic understanding of the Anthropocene as a unified human experience. The framing of the Anthropocene around a universalizing species paradigm has a homogenizing effect that hides significant exclusions and inequalities. Not all humans are equally implicated in the major forces driving contemporary human environmental crises. And not all humans, and as we will learn today, hardly any non-humans are invited into the conceptual spaces where these disasters are theorized or responses to disaster formulated. If we really want to do something to change the current economic system, we need to be capable of developing a more inclusive conversation. And we need to be capable of building a global economy that is no longer focused on conquering nature, but on learning how to coexist with the plurality of life forms around us. Pluralizing the Anthropocene features well-known scholars committed to developing a more inclusive and diverse understanding of Anthropocene debates of resilience, adaptation, and the struggle for environmental justice. Every talk will be followed by an informal conversation and a Q&A session with the audience via the chat function. The chat function is currently closed, but it will be open towards the end of the Q&A session. If you would like to ask a question, please prepare your question and have it ready to be posted in the chat box during the Q&A session. This talk will be conducted in English. If you need language assistance, Microsoft Teams has a subtitle live transcript function that can be activated by pressing a caption symbol that is usually located, I think, in the right bottom corner of the application. A number of languages are available via this functionality, so please feel free to activate it. Please bear in mind that this event is being recorded by Serraus and will be later released for public viewing via social media and the internet. But let me go back to the main reason why we are all here today. In our first session for this colloquium, we welcome anthropologist Tim Ingold, who argued that we need to rebuild the global economic system around a more encompassing notion of sustainability. In our second session, we invited anthropologist Anna Singh to talk about her most recent collaborative project, the online digital project, Feral Atlas. Singh called for a more plural, historically expanded understanding of the Anthropocene, and she made a compelling case for the need to rewrite the history of modern environmental destruction from a more than human perspective. Today, anthropologist Agustín Fuentes will take this more than human perspective to another level by bringing into focus the ecologies of despair and hope, shaping the human-other animal interface in the Anthropocene. Let me hand over the floor now to my colleague Luísa for her to introduce our distinguished speaker today.
It's my honor to introduce our guest, Agustín Fuentes. He's trained as a zoology and anthropology and is a professor of anthropology at Princeton University. Professor Fuentes' research delves into the how and why of being human. He is interested in both the big questions and the small details of what make humans and our closest relatives tick. Current projects include exploring cooperation, creativity, and belief in human evolution, multi-species anthropologies, evolutionary theory and process, and engaging race and racism. He is also an active public scientist, a well-known blogger, lecturer, tweeter, and a writer and explorer for National Geographic. He has a long list of publications, including a number of influential books on questions on human nature and human evolution. He is author of Race, Monogamy, and Other Lies They Told You, Busting Myths About Human Nature, The Creative Spark, How Imagination Makes Humans Exceptional, and another example, Why We Believe, Evolution and the Human Ways of Being. We are delighted to have you here, Agustín. Thank you so much. And with no further delays, let's listen to Professor Fuentes' talk, Making, Breaking, Reinventing the Human-Other Animal Interface in the Anthropocene. Agustín, the floor is yours. Thank you again.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Gonçalo and Luísa. Thank you, Fundación Cervals, the University of Coimbra, and all of the other sponsors for putting on a really important and really significant set of conversations. I'm really glad to be here. But let me just jump right in. What I would like to do then is to sort of discuss the Anthropocene from maybe a perspective that many have not considered fully. We know that for hundreds of thousands of years, humans have been shaping and managing the world. And recently, we're doing it with increasing speed, influence, and zeal. We've already mentioned the Stefan and Hamilton and Grunwald, these different definitions for what the Anthropocene is. In the previous two lectures in this series, the previous two discussions, the anthropologist Tim Ingold reminds us of the sustainability of everything or of nothing. This idea that sustainability in a serious sense is a necessary conversation of and with the world we inhabit, if there is to be a future. The anthropologist Anna Singh reminds us that we've been detonating the Anthropocene over and over, destroying, wrenching apart much of the planet, and implores us to expand our mapping or conceptualization of the Anthropocene. How are we telling Anthropocene stories? So what I'd like to do today is to take two of these sort of themes, these ideas of sustainability and rethinking how we describe the Anthropocene, and add to that my own little twist. I am particularly interested in the interactions of organisms with mutual ecologies, those that co-produce and co-construct each other's niches. The way we live with others and how others live with us, I think, is of critical importance in understanding the Anthropocene. And that's what I'd like to talk about today. But to do that, I think we need to talk a little bit about our perspective and the theory and the methods by which we engage the Anthropocene. So my punchline here is going to be that we need, if we take this Anthropocene context seriously, to understand others, not just ourselves, as dynamic agents, as participants, as collaborators and partners in this current epoch. So let me first, to frame this discussion, let me first remind you all that this image that I'm showing you right now, this division between the human constructed world and the natural world, is an artifice. This is not the way we should be talking about the world, because this is not an accurate description of the world in which we live. That is, we know that for at least 10, if not 20,000 years, active engagement by humans has reshaped forests and ecotones and landscapes and ecologies across the planet. Humans have been shaping the world as it shapes them for a deep amount of time. So I'm not really interested in when we say the Anthropocene began. I'm interested in what's going on and how do we think about it. And in the current context, today, we have to understand, although that humans have had huge influences on the landscapes and organisms and ecologies around them for millennia, today that influence is not evenly distributed. Not all human groups, not all nations, not all regions, not all locales are impacting the world in the same way. And that's incredibly important for us to consider, especially when we think about who is doing most of the writing and researching on the Anthropocene. We need to maybe think about decentering some of the global north and repositioning some of our interest and input from across the planet, especially those who might not be responsible for much of the destruction on a global scale. I would like to argue that to do this, we really need to just put aside the sort of nature, nurture, human, natural dichotomies and reconceptualize the reality in which we all exist. We all, and when I say we, I don't mean just humans, I mean everything on the planet. We all live in anthromes, anthropogenic biomes. Human influence, impact, and structure for centuries or millennia has reshaped, shaped, and actively is shaping every aspect of the world. And I think starting from that as our baseline is important. Donna Haraway and many other scholars using different terms, Anthropocene, Capitalocene, Plantationocene, Cthulhucene, have illustrated the complexities of this moment that is ongoing, past, present, and future. And so we need to just push aside nature and nurture, human and natural, and just look at where we are, what's happening, and how can we best understand it and best create a hopeful future. I think, and this is one of my final theoretical contributions here, I think with a lot of scholars that may fall outside of the mainstream canon of those discussing anthromes and Anthropocene and multi-species perspectives, I would like to suggest that those of us working in this area and everyone thinking about this might want to think with Indigenous scholars and scholars who are bringing to bear from different peripheries and contexts, not just the standard approaches, but approaches that enliven our understanding and think through this. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is enriched by engaging with these scholars. All right, so here's where we are. The processes of the planet are converting from landscapes that look like this to landscapes that look like this. And the central actor in much of this is the human. But what we cannot forget is that the human has never been alone in this process. Never been alone on so many levels. And understanding that is a critical first step in refocusing our theory and method when it comes to the Anthropocene. How have we never been alone? Well, let us say that our own bodies, within the bodies, the multitudes of microbes and viral engagements have been and are ongoing. The human can be best thought of, as Scott Gilbert, Lin Xu, Joan Roughgarden, and others tell us, as the holobiont, the conglomeration of multiple populations of taxa and organisms and species in this thing we call the human body. As Natalie Porter and I wrote recently, even giving birth, right? The human is not just birthing another human, but is birthing a whole nother complex of relationships of multiple organisms. We need to take this seriously and recognize that the human is never alone at this level. But what I want to focus on is other large organisms, not just those that live in and around and along our bodies. When we think of the human relationship with other organisms, we tend to classify it simplistically. Let me demonstrate today that the human-other-animal relationship is never easy to understand, nor is it standard, nor does it come in only a few forms. It's incredibly complex. So while many scholars think about how humans in the Anthropocene have domesticated species, have shaped other species to our own end, have sort of remodeled their bodies and genomes to serve particular purposes, I would like to suggest that's only one small part of our relationships to other organisms. We need to think about all of the landscapes on the planet and all of those species who are part of our ecosystems, who shape them along with us, who inhabit them, who structure them, and who rework ecologies through their actions as active agents co-constructing realities in which humans also exist. So again, my interest here is to refocus some of our discourse on the Anthropocene on a greater understanding of the organisms with mutual ecologies, those that we co-produce and co-construct other niches, and trying to understand their behavioral, ecological, and physiological ways must be a central focus if we're really to understand what's going on in the Anthropocene, not just for humans, but for all of us, and how we can think to generate sustainable, hopeful, possible, fruitful futures. So to do that, I'd like to spend a little time with you thinking about three main themes: making, breaking, and reinventing. The first two, making and breaking in particular, is what most people who discuss the Anthropocene are focusing on. So we'll talk about making briefly, about breaking briefly, but then I want to spend the rest of my talk on reinventing, thinking new theoretical and methodological, or existing theoretical and methodological, but technologies and processes that are not included. And I want us to think about reinventing ourselves and our questions and thinking with the Anthropocene along those lines. So, breaking. We've already heard much in this symposium and in our daily lives about humans breaking the world. We're actually quite good at it. Humans are unsurpassed in their ability to destroy landscapes at local, regional, national, and global levels. We have no doubt about that. In fact, we are in the midst, probably, of what could be the sixth mass extinction, the sixth largest mass extinction in the history of the planet. And we know very clearly, and here I'll show you evidence from some work colleagues and I have done, we know very clearly, for example, for the primates, that group of mammals to which humans belong, 60% of the primates are threatened with extinction, 75% are losing their populations rapidly, and 100% of that cause are humans. We know this, and we know this for many, many, many systems across the planet. So humans break the world consistently, and we do so recently with increasing power, frequency, and capacity. That's a horrendous problem, but that's not my focus here today. While we think about breaking, and we know that's such an important component, we also need to think about making organisms. What most people don't think, because they're so focused on the breaking, is this reality that as anthromes change, as human manipulations of environments and landscapes shift, it changes the evolutionary and ecological processes that affect development and physiology of other organisms. So the very fact that humans are creating anew in the world creates new patterns and processes of development in other organisms, creating novel behavioral variants, developmental processes, even novel patterns of genetic expression. We know, for example, that in cities, in urban landscapes, organisms that are not human exist and co-construct and co-create these landscapes, and they go through different types of evolutionary processes and developmental patterns, leading to all sorts of new morphologies, new body shapes and sizes, new foraging patterns, new kinds of physiology, new soundscapes leading to new vocalizations or new auditory processes and patterns. So while we constantly focus on the breaking, we need to also remember and be aware that a major part of the Anthropocene is making anew, new processes and new life is developing. It's not all about the human. There are many, many things radiating, spreading, diversifying at the same time that many are going extinct or falling apart because of human action. So we need to keep this breaking and this making sort of together as we consider the Anthropocene. What I'd like to do, though, having acknowledged the breaking and the making, is to spend a little time with you thinking about reinventing, rethinking method and theory for the Anthropocene so that it is not just for humans. So we are not philosophizing or even applying political engagement just to humans. The political, economic, and philosophical perceptual realities of the world today are for all organisms. And as humans, being majorly responsible for the breaking of much of the world, it is our responsibility to be more attuned, more attentive, and to offer, if we can, more assistance to other organisms by focusing a little bit of our Anthropocene inquiry on their processes and patterns in the anthropogenic world. Now, a quick note here. I'm about to show you a number of pictures of humans and monkeys and humans and other animals in close proximity. I want to acknowledge especially the incredible work by the IUCN Primate Species Group section for human-primate interactions, who've been pushing against haphazard or dangerous tourist pictures or social media pictures of humans touching and engaging or grabbing monkeys or other organisms. We need to be very aware of the risks that brings and the possible dangers that self-centered positioning of ourselves next to other organisms can do. I show you these pictures here because they reflect ongoing relationships, not self-human-centered tourist relationships. Keep that in mind, please. All right, so if we're going to refocus, right, if we're going to reinvent some of our perspectives, let me offer a lens through ethnoprimatology, the approach to the study of the primates writ large in their interfaces and relationships with human cultural, historical, political, and economic contexts. I would like to suggest that the basic premises of ethnoprimatology, in fact, can apply in a much broader sense. So let me put forward ethnoprimatology as a theory for most things. Well, what are we suggesting here? Well, when we consider the normal behavior of other species, we should consider that much of that normality has developed in interface and association with human radically altered ecologies, right? Anthropogenic context, being with humans and responding to them, is a normal part of other organisms' lives, not a recent innovation for many, many organisms. Let us also get rid of the assumption that human populations have not, or human impacts on ecologies have not been altering, structuring, and shaping the evolutionary trajectories of other species, because they have, right? We know that for millennia, thousands, if not tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years, human action has affected some and increasingly many, and maybe all, of other organisms' evolutionary and ecological processes. And let us also recognize that there are complex biological, behavioral, phylogenetic, physiological relationships between humans and other organisms that co-produce one another. And because of this co-production, let us not think of the skin boundary or the species boundary as hard and fast. Let us think not just about the exchange of pathogens and viruses, but about the exchange of lives and behaviors and contexts. Let us take seriously the need to understand both human and other species behaviors, histories, perceptions, actions, and emotions as part of our intellectual endeavor. To help us do that, I would argue that let me just acknowledge, many of my colleagues have been doing this in incredibly wonderful ways. This is being done in ethnoprimatology and across much of the multi-species anthropological landscape. Let me also really emphasize that to do this well, to recognize the multiplicity of relationships between humans and other organisms in the Anthropocene, we need to decenter, or at least to augment and expand beyond traditional, what I'm going to call here, Western academic and intellectual approaches. We need to recognize that the world is incredibly diverse, not just in sort of what kinds of animals and biomes and forest types and organisms live out there, but in the way in which humans have been and continue to relate to other organisms. There is not just one way to see the world. There are many successful ways to be human and many successful and unsuccessful ways to interact as a human with others. One huge fault in the contemporary, particularly academic discourse on the Anthropocene is the fact that we are not engaging sufficiently with a diversity of cultural modes of interaction, specifically with Indigenous voices from around the world, have much to inform us about alternative possibilities to a traditional Western, or let's say even a Kantian human nature divide. That is not the only way to see the world. Notions of different kinds of personhoods, entangled ecologies, and shared kinships through the lived experience of different cultures around the planet inform diverse modalities and theoretizations of how we can see and envision and understand the relationships between human and others. There's not only one way to describe these relations, and incorporating multiple perspectives on these relations makes us much more attuned to possibilities and therefore potential alternatives to the current trajectories or the current limitations that we have. There's actually one more reason why we should be very attentive to Indigenous voices of scholars and Indigenous individuals around the planet, because at this point, Indigenous peoples manage or maintain almost 40 million square kilometers of land in 87 countries that intersects with 37% of the world's last remaining landscapes and ecosystems with low-level industrial impact, and about 36% of the world's last intact forest landscapes. Indigenous peoples are primary actors, managers, stewards, and conservators, and central stakeholders in ecosystems that matter. Thus, they are critical partners and primary decision makers in the research and conservation actions. If the Anthropocene Academy, if the intellectual life and engagement at the Anthropocene is not seriously engaged with this diversity of experience and perspective, we will not bring to bear sufficient theoretical and methodological tools to move forward. Let me reflect a little bit on my own work to illustrate a few of these points. I was lucky enough for many, many years to work with humans and macaque monkeys and many others in the island of Bali, Indonesia. In these areas of Bali where human cultural, religious, economic, and structural landscapes interface with a myriad of other species and beings, tangible and intangible, a kind of integrative Anthropocene reality is ongoing. Entering there as a Western-trained scientist, I came to look at monkeys and their ecology and their behavior. Almost immediately, through my exposure to my Balinese colleagues and to the macaque monkeys who wandered around in this area, I recognized that my questions were faulty, that my eyesight was myopic, and that my ability to understand what was going on was severely inhibited. So I learned and listened by asking questions about perspectives, about sensations, about connections, and about thinking with all of the participants, human, macaque, dogs, trees, and trying to look at these relationships not as just a pattern of structural ecology or behavior, but as a complex cultural, historical, lived, and experienced multi-species connection. That taught me a great humility, demonstrating that I really did not understand how these processes and systems interlaced and entangled. It taught me clearly that the macaques that I was so interested in had not read any of the textbooks I had and were not behaving according to plan. And it showed me potential in ways to expand my own intellectual engagement, such that my interest growing from this experience pointed out that if I truly wish to understand these complex anthromes, this relationship between people, monkeys, temple landscapes, rice fields, forests, global tourism, local tourism, and political contexts, I had to work with a team with diverse members and take the macaques on their own terms, not trying to constrain them or impose a particular interpretation on their behavior. This kind of work led me to ask a multiplicity of questions, but really made me focus, for example, on how macaque monkeys, not just their behavioral ecology, but in fact, how they were living in the world. So in work in Singapore, in a dense urban environment, we asked, what do their genetics look like in this area? Not so much to say, well, what is their population genetic spread, but how is this population genetic spread related to the history of Singapore, the jungles, the urban development, the cities? How has the genetic patterns of this species, Macaca fascicularis, long-tailed macaques, mapped across all of Southeast Asia, not just how it maps ecologically or geospatially, but how does it map to human history, to cultural variations, to the onset of urbanization and the dramatic changes in agriculture and tourism processes. I also brought the same kinds of questions to look at macaques in throughout other places, including Gibraltar and in Singapore, where we partnered with macaques to have sustainable modes of GPS collar tracking that enabled us to ask questions: how do macaques not live in the human world, but live with and alongside humans? And how do macaques react in foraging contexts to trash delivery routes, to the daily routines of the workers, to the changes in bus and public transportation routes as part of their normative ecology? It taught me to focus on organisms as co-constituents, co-constructors of these anthropogenic ecologies, and not just as the recipients of human harm and damage. By looking at a century's worth of newspaper articles in Gibraltar about the macaques, we learned about humans' perceptions of them and tried to connect that to the macaques' lives and their contexts. All of this work forced me to recognize that if I'm really interested in the Anthropocenic context, if we really want to know what are the complex interweavings between multiple species in a given context, we have to respect that those multiple species are interconnected and therefore fully agential in these relationships. Of course, having different contexts of power and influence and structure, but understanding how macaques live in the world today means understanding how they live in a human-structured landscape as co-participants and co-constructors of that landscape. This has led to the current project, which we call the Long-Tailed Macaque Project, just starting now, co-directed by Malene Hansen of Copenhagen, and a large cast of affiliated researchers and collaborators from across multiple countries in Southeast Asia, where we're going to ask, how do the long-tailed macaques map to human realities? How do they engage? How are they distributed? What do the interfaces look like? How is the COVID-19 upsurge in global and illegal trade of macaques affecting them? How are all of these different political, economic, and ecological processes from the local to the regional level impacting the macaques, and how are the macaques actually engaging with this? So taking seriously the role of other organisms is central to the Anthropocene. Organisms with mutual ecologies that co-produce and co-construct each other's niches in behavioral, ecological, and physiological ways are central to our understanding of the Anthropocene. That is what I've learned from my own work and what I've learned by reading and engaging with the work of others. For example, Marcus Baines Rock's work on urban hyenas in the city of Harar was an incredible ethnographic engagement with humans and hyenas to understand their mutual relationships, their connections, and to give a hyena-focused spin to our understanding of these predators, who are usually cast aside and pictured as separate from the human world, but in Harar and in Marcus Baines Rock's work shows us that they are not separate from the human world, but that humans and hyenas share a deep history. And recent work has demonstrated that, in fact, urban versus non-urban hyenas actually behave in different contexts with different kinds of perceptual psychologies and activities. True understanding of the world in the Anthropocene involves deep engagement with other organisms as part of this process, not just as the recipients of it. And I highly encourage everyone to read Marcus Baines-Rock's most recent book, Crocodile Undone, where he has taken this approach and he's looking at fauna organisms across Australia who have never been tamed, who have never been domesticated, and trying to understand from their perspective what's going on, not just why haven't humans manipulated them in the appropriate way, but rather asking the question, what are these integral and interesting relationships from the perspective of the other organism, not just the perspective of the human. I would also suggest attention to Piers Locke and Jane Buckingham and others' work on the relationships between elephants and humans in South Asia. Here we see this incredible complexity of deep time relationship between this incredibly widespread, highly disruptive mammal, humans, and one of the largest land mammals on the planet, the Asian elephant, and their deep time ecological, cultural, historical, economic relationships. How do these pan out? How have they panned out not just as sort of humans using elephants or elephants disrupting humans' lives or ecologies, but how do these co-construct one another? And how has that shaped both species' relationships and realities? Finally, as an example, just because I'm trying to convince everyone in the audience that the Anthropocene is about all of us, and all of us means all species, and therefore we need to not just understand the human engagement, but the other species' engagement back with us. And dogs are a perfect example. Dogs and humans have been shaping each other for 20, 25,000 years, maybe more. And it's this co-shaping of cultures, of evolutionary processes, of development, and of the way in which we construct kin that is critically important. We know that this relationship between humans and dogs has mutually shaped each other's physiologies, the way we see the world, and the way we see other organisms. This is a central component of the Anthropocene. And studying the Anthropocene, then, we must center not just breaking, not just the alterations that other organisms go through or making that other organisms go through because of human manipulations, but we must reinvent our inquiry to include substantive roles of others, even in the context of making and breaking, but substantive roles of others for their shaping of us and for their navigating of the human worlds. We need to give other organisms credit for their participation, their engagement, and their importance, especially if we want the future to have those organisms still be around. So I would argue it's time for us to rethink some of the methods and theory for a multi-species reality of the Anthropocene. We need to recognize that interfaces between humans and others is normal. That has been our and their lives for millennia. This is what the world is like. Recently, humans have ramped up the breaking. And so understanding the relationships that were before the breaking, during the breaking, will help us understand how the future can be reimagined and reinvented in ways that are not just reliant on a destructive pattern. So to do that, I would say we need to always think that there are more than just humans in the game. It's not just about humans. Humans have an incredible amount of power. We do an incredible amount of destruction, but it's not just about us. More functional, structural, and practical work on other species needs to be done for us to truly understand the patterns and processes of the Anthropocene. Ecological and biological processes, in addition to the broader sort of humanistic, cultural, and philosophical engagement, really matter. We need to bring those things together, not treat them as separate. We need hybrid methodologies, and they must include material ecologies, actual observation and measuring of what organisms do in this world, if we really want to understand the patterns and processes of the Anthropocene. We obviously need an integrative or transdisciplinary engagement for that. And I would say, and this is my own bias, but anthropology, biology, and ecology should be mandatory in any engagement with the Anthropocene. Co-ecologies are the norm. And if that's the case, right? If we really are always in these multi-species ecological contact with humans doing an inordinate amount of the breaking and making, we need to then have multiple levels of analysis: genomic, organismal, population, landscape, ecosystem, cultural, historical, political, economic, working together as our baseline. That means working in teams, that means working outside of our own disciplines, connecting with others, and it means working outside of just the sort of traditional Western academy. Ethnography and multiple perspectives on relationality are central, and that comes from including diverse voices from around the world with different kinds of backgrounds and training. And especially, as I mentioned before, we need to include Indigenous scholars, Indigenous stakeholders, and Indigenous voices as core collaborators in this discussion, or we are not going to understand what the range of possibilities are for a sustainable and successful future. The sciences and the humanities need to work together on this. People say this all the time, but now this is more important than ever. And if we don't do it, we fail. Why do we fail? For everything I've just laid out, but also think about what the future brings. It's not just about what I've identified here, but the future clearly is going to be even more complicated. And here I thank Sarah Derimer for these incredible images that are actually not that far-fetched, and my amazing colleague Eben Kirksey for his book, The Mutant Project on CRISPR. If we think just a little bit into the future and we're not really paying attention to other organisms and how they are in the world, then we're going to be truly lost, because changes are afoot, and those changes flit under our noses if we only focus on human breaking. So let us expand to focus on a reinvention of how we ask questions. The punchline is that the Anthropocene involves everyone and everything. Let's take that seriously. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Excellent. We have a lot to think about. Certainly the audience will have questions that can ask in the chat. And what you present, and in general, your research, I would say it's in an interface between the biological anthropology and social and cultural anthropology. And this is very innovative. You articulate several disciplinary areas to address your research questions. As you said, and before, and I have the feeling that interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity are often pointed out as a path that should follow, but this rarely occurs even within the research teams. Each area ends up to dialoguing only with its own area. And however, the opposite has been seen in your lecture, that it seems to be the way. And can you please tell us a little about your experience of carrying out this type of approach, in particular in this time of great specialization of knowledge? What advice can you give to us, to students, to researchers, and how can disciplinary barriers be broken to face this Anthropocene and all these problems that we have to deal today?
Well, thanks, Annalisa. It's so important to recognize that transdisciplinarity is very difficult, but it's very possible, right? And so I think there's, let's say, three things that I think are very important. One is to recognize that any one of us as a scholar or an investigator or an activist, we don't have sufficient training and knowledge to really engage in the scope to do the kind of work we want to do. And so we need to reach out to collaborate, to be intellectually generous and open to sort of working with others to create teams of scholars and activists and practitioners to get stuff done. So that's the first thing, to humbly admit that we may know a lot, but we're not even close, given the complexity of the world and the amount of information out there. So that's number one. The second thing is that training programs, PhD programs, master's programs, training programs for field contexts and practical conservation or engagement with the Anthropocene, training programs need to start from the get-go, from the very baseline of trying to provide people with maybe not all of the knowledge, but some training on how to connect with others and how to generate this. So we need to create the expectation that, say, if you're doing a PhD, you're doing a doctorate, you have to learn a very specific method and theory and apply that, but you need to know who to talk to, who to connect with, to expand your specific area to make it connect with larger, more practical, or to make it more effective in the broad sense. So we need to know, one, that the baseline should be a broad basis of connectivity. We should work in teams. That two, that our training programs should train people very well to do specific things, but to know how to connect with others. And three, I think, and I'm going to sort of come back again, we need to be much more, and I'm going to use this term, intellectually generous and not possessive of knowledges. There are so many different kinds of knowledges out there that are relevant to understanding the Anthropocene because of all the complexity and messiness in it. We need to be more open and more intent on seeking out different voices and different possibilities. So I think there are many other things, but I think those three things are central. And I would add, this is not a fourth, but this is over all of that. Those agencies, foundations, and governments who fund this work, they need to start funding complex, collaborative from the get-go projects, as opposed to sort of the traditional sort of monodisciplinary or monotopical. The funders need to drive this, because without funding, without support for this kind of innovative research, it's extremely difficult.
Thank you. Yes. And I have the feeling that when we search for financial support, the reviewers are very focused in particular problems and not sometimes this broad vision. Another thought, in your presentation, you cross the world, and a part of the world population is alert to the problems of the sustainability of the life on the planet. But as you said, for many others, and everyday life is made up of concerns about daily survival.
Right.
And in the other extreme are people who feel that money solves everything. You talk about this in the end of your talk, but can you please develop a little more about what is the rule, or what role can scientists play when the decisions are taken by the politicians?
Yeah, so this is, again, something I didn't really touch on, although you could see it's underneath a lot of this. Let me just state explicitly, neoliberal capitalist models and contemporary political multinational structures are doing much of the breaking. That is clear. I don't think this is a radical assertion. We have very good evidence for that. Those models, however, are dominant models, and they control a lot of the discourse and a lot of what can be done, especially at international global scale levels. So what do we do about that? Well, I would argue that scientists who are gathering an enormous amount of the data and the knowledge about this have an especially important role, not to stay just in the academy, not to just sort of be happy to sort of sit back and publish our work and, you know, continue to get a little bit of grant money and, you know, maybe a nicer office. The goal here is critical. It's not like we're not under incredible pressure. The point is that scientists, that researchers engaging with this, all have a dual responsibility to their discipline, to their career, to their students, to their institutions, and to the rest of the world, including other species. And so I think this division, which we've long, as academics and scientists, been told is not the thing to do, the division between the academy and activism has always been with this big line between it. I think that has to blur. Activism is not a bad word. Practice, the application of knowledge from the academy into the world with hopefully beneficial effects, should be the goal of what we do. And I would argue that scientists need to be more vociferous, even if it's frustrating. And I know it is all the time, but that we really don't have another option. Sitting back and just printing and publishing more papers, that we now know, the evidence is in, that doesn't work. The data by themselves are never enough. Action is needed. And we, not alone, but scientists can be part of the action that changes the world, but only part of it if we're serious about engaging with others, humble in realizing that our knowledge is just one part of the knowledge necessary, but connecting and really trying to make a difference.
Thank you. I will give the word to Gonçalo, who will certainly have some questions too.
Yes, thank you, Luísa, and thanks, Agustín, for this wonderful talk. I mean, I have a bit of a wild question because I was genuinely charmed by your plea to sort of give agency to non-human animals. I mean, as you pointed out in your presentation, you know, non-human animals in research papers come across as either invisible or else as some kind of victims. And you're kind of, you know, asking us to kind of rethink, reset, and, you know, start thinking about giving agency to non-human animals that live in human-altered landscapes as co-participants and co-constructors, as you said. And I was kind of thinking to myself about the larger implications of what you're saying, because you're not just making a theoretical argument here. And, you know, what would the legal system, for example, that looked at non-human animals as co-participants and co-constructors in sort of human-altered landscapes would look like? Would you push that far? Would you call for your model, your vision to kind of, you know, affect the way our very legal system, for example, is currently constructed?
Well, and that's a great question, and one that deserves a lot of attention. And I'm going to not sidestep it, but I'm going to say that if before we get to the legal consideration, which I actually think is quite important, and let me point out that many societies today and throughout history, human cultures have engaged non-human persons, other than human persons, as legal co-constructors and co-constituents of their society. But let's put that aside for a moment. And I would say that before we get to the legal context in the contemporary world for many of the, let's say, much of the global north, we need to understand political, economic, and ecological participation. So I think before we get to the legal discourse, we need to think about what does it mean to share the world with other species seriously in the word share, not to exploit, to extract, to control, to dominate, but to share. And so I think that's a first kind of political and social step. And if that step is undertaken, then we can begin to, I think, discuss actually very important legal questions that come to, for example, I was talking about the long-tailed macaque, Macaca fascicularis, right? Here in the COVID-19 landscape, there's giant uptick of desire for the biopharmaceutical companies to extract those individuals, persons, macaques from the wild to experiment upon. There should be a legal structure surrounding that, much more than there currently is, and there should be recognition of what that means and doesn't mean. Everyone is ready to give a certain amount of agency to SARS-CoV-2 in the current moment, to the particular virus, especially the different strains of the virus that are doing most harm to humans. But I would argue that if we're going to do that, we should also seriously consider the beneficial relationships we have with songbirds of particular species in particular areas, the beneficial relationships we have with many other kinds of mammals and engagements. So I would say that we need to step back and ask, what are these relations and these entanglements? What are they really doing socially, physiologically, ecologically? And then if we can get to that level, then I think we can talk about political and especially legal relationships, which should get attention.
You mentioned in your talk that anthropologists have described very thoroughly, actually, cultural environments in which actually animals have that role of co-participants and co-constructors of the reality in which people live in, right? And you argue yourself in your paper that indigenous peoples must be recognized as primary actors, and be sort of involved in as primary decision makers in research and conservation debates, impacting primates and also other species, right? Do you know any examples of big science projects involving indigenous stakeholders, around these debates?
So yes and no, right? I think right now it's important to recognize that there are a number of scholars, particularly in Amazonia, Brazilian scholars, international scholars, collaborating with indigenous groups in Brazil, in Amazonia, in different South American countries, and in other places of the world that are seeking these collaborations. We see this in some parts of the Democratic Republic of Congo with some international and local scholars, and you can see attempts at this in parts of Southeast Asia as well. Have there been widespread, really prominent, large-scale, enormously well-supported projects in this area? Not to my knowledge. And let me be very clear. When I say indigenous scholars, indigenous stakeholders, and individuals need to be part of this project, I am not re-invoking a kind of noble savage argument. I am not saying that all indigenous peoples are in harmony with the world. I am saying that we, by not engaging this incredibly diverse range of peoples, are ignoring important modes of relation that are existing already that we can learn from if we are serious about sustainable futures. I think that's the most important thing. I'm not saying that everything works better in a particular context. I'm saying that if we cut off threads of data or knowledge, we're obviously doing worse science.
Okay, we have a very quick question from the audience already, from Olatz Gonçalves Abisqueta. Thank you very much, Agustín. Very interesting talk. You said we have never been alone, but we have played as if we were alone, right? Do you think this will change after COVID-19 and zoonosis fears, or with the perseverance's promises?
So here is, and I think this is, I intentionally stayed away a little bit from the COVID-19 SARS-CoV-2 relationality, but now since that question came, and thank you very much for the question, look, if we don't take seriously the fact that humans and other organisms have been exchanging viral and microbial pathogens and non-pathogenic viruses and microbes throughout our entire history, and especially intensely in the last many millennia, then we're underplaying a critical part of the ecology of not just humans, but of every organism we interact with. So we should always think about the fact that we're walking through the world, exchanging with things around us, other living things, non-stop. So what I would hope, and I'm not too optimistic, what I would hope is that the SARS-CoV-2 impact, that COVID-19 and the horrors that it has caused, not only show the infrastructural, racist, sexist, politicized biases of hierarchies within human societies and across societies and globally, but they also point out our utter insistence on being ignorant of the patterns and processes of exchange of viruses and microbes with other organisms. We do this all the time, and yet this is not even a main part of basic education, right? In our early childhood education, we should be taught all about the relationship between microbes and viruses and humans. Heck, a huge chunk of our genome is the remnants of viral invasions. That's important, evolutionarily speaking. I'm going off here, but I think it's so important that if we don't wake up and recognize the consistent history, present, and future of viral and other microbial exchanges with organisms, we are doomed to repeat it and maybe even worse next time.
Okay, the questions are truly piling up, Agustín. Another question about livestock. Thank you for a very engaging talk. While I agree that it's crucial to go beyond human destructions, my question is about the enrollment of animals in these breaking works in the Anthropocene. Livestock raised for human purposes are the most numerous animals on Earth. Their lives contribute greatly to the ecological disaster we are facing. What place is there for these great numbers of faceless lives in your analysis? A bit of a livestock.
This is very important. Let me point out that I think if my memory serves, that at any given moment on the planet, there's something like 22 billion chickens, give or take 4 or 5 billion on a rotating basis, depending on how many are slaughtered on a given day. We know that industrial farming, industrial engagement with livestock has massive breaking effects on the planet in numerous ways, and has, I would argue, incredible deleterious effects, but also has formed the center of economic and ecological structuring and political power in much of the world for many countries. So I would argue we need to reconceptualize not simply the relationship between humans and other organisms, but rather the economic and political realities of large-scale agribusiness, and think more seriously about food creation and distribution, and we should think about human lives as multi-species relationships with all of those, with cows, with chickens, with diverse kinds of farmed fishes and wild captured fishes, with seafood. We are not thinking about the lives, the agency, the experiences intermixed, entangled with all of these other organisms. And I think that should be our focus, right? So I would argue that it is one of the biggest simultaneously making and breaking problems that face us in the Anthropocene. And when I say us, I'm talking about the world, not just humans. We need to do something about it because it is not sustainable. It is not sustainable. And as a major factor in that, we humans need to, I think, reconceptualize the political, economic, and physiological engagement we have with other species that we use as food, and try to reconceptualize that in a more sustainable and a more respectful and humble manner.
Okay, lots of questions also about urban environments. Particularly curious about your work in Singapore. Someone asks, could you please elaborate a little bit more on your work on Singapore? How have the macaques there co-shaped the city and other aspects? In addition to the works you have mentioned, could you please recommend some human-animal relation work in hyper-modernized, wealthy cities? Thank you so much.
So this should be a major area of research, and it's an area that's hard to get funded. And let me acknowledge the National Parks Board at Singapore, my colleagues Michael Gummert, and a number of other scholars and individuals that have the ongoing research in Singapore. There are many Singaporeans who are leading this engagement and today are doing this research. What we did in the early 2000s and up through the middle of the last decade is really ask questions about the relationships between humans and macaques in Singapore with an eye towards perceptions and ranging and genetic and behavioral structures. So we were asking the question, how does the interface between monkeys and people map to construction, to landscape use, to business routes, to the building of condominiums, to the sense of tourism, to the sense of nature versus urban. And there's a lot of really interesting work there. And there's increasing work on urban ecosystems, but it's frequently not treated as normative. We think of it as strange that other animals thrive in urban ecologies, when in fact many animals do not, but those that do are fascinating. Let us think here in North America, where I am right now, about coyotes, right? Canis latrans, spreading across all of North America and doing very well in urban landscapes. Let us think about raccoons, about rats, about squirrels, about a wide variety of birds, all of which actually create the soundscape. They create part of the pathogen landscape. They create part of the nocturnal realities, and they create really ways in which human economic and political structures of communities, of trash services, of whole industries to try to remove these animals, and which are almost always unsuccessful. How do all of those things map together? Those are the kinds of projects that I think should be happening in the future to understand what is it to live in a city as a multi-species landscape. But I have to be honest, right now there are very few studies that are very interdisciplinary that are engaging this. But there are projects across the world, particularly by many geographers and some zoologists, really looking at these patterns. It's quite interesting.
Okay, we have a spiritual question, a great spiritual question from Kennedy Opande, who asks, what is the place of non-human subjects in your methodology and theory? And in this case, I mean agents such as spirits. that also shape the Anthropocene, especially in African societies where these have a great influence to human and other relations. So a question about spirituality, spirits. What is the place of spirits in mutual ecologies?
So let me state unequivocally that this is a critical reason why one certain knowledge tradition or one tradition of inquiry cannot be the only way that we engage the world. For much of the world, even those who don't admit it, the unseen, that is the real, the felt, the experienced, but the unseen, is a central part of experience, is a central part of how we live our lives. And so one thing that I learned working in Bali is that that landscape, so the temple forest where I work had macaques, had tourists, had local Balinese, had Javanese tourists, had tourists from around the world and diverse peoples and dogs. There were also a variety of spirits who lived in that forest, right? Those spirits, their interaction, their perception by people and others shaped the way we moved on the landscape, shaped what we did and did not do in relation to trees and to other components. And that real shaping by unseen forces that are perceived and felt and experienced by multiple individuals, I think is an important part of our understanding. And so the question, I remember one of my students asking years ago, but is that real? And my question to them was, why would you ask such a question? The real question to ask is sort of, how do people react, think, and experience the world? Let us take that and use that to understand what the world is, not to tell them what is real and what is not. Real perception in humans always consists of the material, what we can feel, and the immaterial that we cannot feel, but we know is there. And I think that's important, cross-cultural, that's unique, that's ubiquitous among humans, and that should be part of our understanding of the world.
Michael Hirschfeld has a question as well. He says, I fully agree that activism is not about work. I think these were your words, Agustín, right?
Yeah.
But trying to put funding on a broad basis, as you suggest, runs a risk, as we have already seen in much of Europe, which is that the detailed work that anthropologists typically do in defiance of the neoliberal insistence on deliverables will be completely eliminated. How would you suggest we can resist that?
That is a wonderful question, and my answer is going to be depressing because I think I'm going to be trying to answer that question for the rest of my life, and I'm just not 100% sure I'll ever find an answer. The push against this neoliberal assumption that there's always a quantitative growth, an outcome from projects rather than an expansion or a change in knowledge is deleterious, right? And so I think the current funding strategies, and that's why I mentioned that earlier, if foundations, and this is where private foundations with lots of money need to step up. They need to step up and fund research and engagement that isn't just focused on a traditional neoliberal or sort of capitalistic model of outcomes. This is where individuals and foundations that have the capacity need to foster dialogue, discourse, and interactive context. This is where, for example, Serralves, right? Fundación Serralves is putting on this talk, right? This series of seminars, this kind of engagement. We need for those who have power in an economic sense to step forward and to support this kind of work, to listen to the scientists, to the humanists, to the indigenous communities, and support them in their efforts. Because unfortunately, my sense is that most governments are too vested in a particular, I would argue, yes, neoliberal model of outcomes to really take a chance on truly pluralizing research into the Anthropocene and offering us possible solutions to a hopeful future.
Lots of questions as well about plants, which of course were not the focus of your talk, but how would you place talks in your mutual ecologies model?
So plants are incredibly important, and I direct folks to an article that I wrote with Marcus Baines-Rock, who I referenced as hyena. The article that we wrote, actually, he argues about a relationship between cat, the plant, hyenas, and humans, and I think it's a wonderful way to think with the sort of interspecies and multi-species connections. And I It's really just amount of time and the kind of work I've done that I didn't mention plants, because plants are absolutely central in everything we do. And plants are dynamic and active. And I think this has been really noted recently. Eduardo Cohn's book about how forests think has been very influential, and I think importantly so. But even more than that, scholars and researchers working across the planet have recognized how human-plant interfaces and entanglements have shaped our bodies. Human bodies have shaped plant bodies and have shaped relationships. And this is what I tell my students every chance I get. What did you eat today, right? An enormous component of that was these manipulated, complex, anthropocenic plants. Do you respect them? Do you understand them? Do you know what their relationships are to you and your relationships or even obligations to them? So yeah, I think our entanglement with plants is very important. Just due to limitations of time, I gave them the short end of the stick in this talk.
Anat Singh's talk, the previous talk of the colloquium, focused a lot on history, sort of in historical perspectives, and history also came a little bit in your presentation. There are a couple of questions from the audience that focus on historical issues. So, for example, Joana Formosinho, she says, we have a narrative challenge. How do we tell multi-species stories that cross scales and temporalities?
Well, so I think this is very important, because the best multi-species stories I have been exposed to have come from my work either with indigenous peoples in places far from where I'm sitting right now in North America, because that's where my work with folks has been, or from historical engagements, even in some of these traditional Western canons, where other organisms play central roles. Even today, we can see these narratives ongoing, but the dominant Anthropocene narrative has humans as breakers, humans as the power, humans as controllers, humans as the demons. And I think we need to step around that perspective and try to tell our stories more as entanglements. Yes, humans are frequently on the end of breaking things, but not always. And I think if we think more seriously and agentially with other organisms, our narratives might get better. I think history has a lot to teach us here. By reading cross-culturally and cross-temporally, we can see that for many societies, other organisms have played central roles in structuring perceptual and lived realities. And I think we need to recognize that and maybe bring some of that back into our daily lives.
Andrea Brandel also has a question about art. She notes that art has been largely absent from your beautiful or beautifully crafted presentation, lots of very nice images. And she wonders why in your presentation art was not mentioned as part of the interdisciplinary conversations that you were sort of pushing for. Could you comment a little bit on that?
Yeah, and I would, yes, and it is absolutely right. And I would argue that at the very end, I ended with those images from Sarah Dermer, which is incredible art, right? The creation of new possible sort of organisms. And throughout the way I used imagery, I was trying to use many drawings or pictures, images to convey information. I would argue that art is central in our sort of discourse and the way we represent. I think art does a better job in many ways than words of conveying much of the complexity of the Anthropocene. And so I really wholly believe that visual representation, be it visual arts, be it dance, be it kind of media or multimodal graphics, I think are central important in our ability to translate knowledge into the world, but also in our ability to actually empathize and hold on to things. So yeah, I would argue art is an incredibly important tool. And again, just because of time, I didn't sort of go down that path, but I have a whole suite of ideas that I would love to see different kinds of arts be a central component of scientific endeavors. And I think, let me just give two quick nods here. One is communication via graphic novels, which I think are just absolutely incredible modes of sort of telling complex narratives in very engaging ways, and really amazing multimodal video technology, engagement with animations and complexities, and the world of social media that's really exemplifying that now. I think the arts writ large have to be a center of our ability to engage with the Anthropocene effectively.
Also, two other questions about global north-south contrasts and some concerns about how calling for more involvement with indigenous scholars may actually shift the burden of responsibility to global south. Could you comment a little bit on that as well?
I think that's a politically very astute frame. I think one thing we have to be careful here is to recognize center versus periphery. And here I draw on my colleagues in Mexico, Juan Manuel Argüelles and Bernardo Yanez, who were sort of working on some of these thoughts. This notion of centers and peripheries of academic power, right, are very important. And what we need to recognize is, I use global north, there are other, we could call this hegemonic centers of discourse and investigation, whatever you want to call them. These are centers of power economically and politically. And so what I would like to do is shift political power in some senses away from these centers in decision-making processes, in sort of the construction of research and the sort of structuring of these collaborative engagements. But the problem is the economic resources remain in these centers of power, right? And so I think the challenge here is, how does one loosen those economic resources so they flow from the center to the periphery without enforcing a kind of obligation for the periphery to step up infrastructurally, when at this point that's not possible. So I would like to say mutualities of collaboration don't hold, I'm not saying for a complete equal distribution of all contexts, because we know economically and politically that is not true right now. So I would argue that right now I see many under-engaged areas of the world as necessary in conceptualizing projects and carrying them out, but that the economic resources and some of the political clout to make those happen still do reside in these sort of centers of research engagement.
Okay, question from the same viewer, second question from the same viewer. How do you see a reimagining of multi-species work occurring with plants and animals that do not engage so obviously in mutual ecologies? To the human eye, at least, I am thinking about how we foster a more inclusive term to learn with insects or other invertebrates and plants, even when they do not engage with us as mammals do. I say this from my area of interest, monarch butterflies.
Oh, well, the monarch butterflies have captured the imaginary of multiple societies. They create a kind of learning, emotive response and experience. They teach us about geography, about wind patterns, about pollution, and about evolutionary and ecological processes. And so I think our ignorance, well, many peoples in many parts of the world are not ignorant of invertebrates, but in the present moment, I would argue that many of us, particularly in centers of academic power, are ignorant of the incredible role that invertebrates play in our daily lives. And I would argue that invertebrates, even those less beautiful and engaging than the monarch butterfly, play central interactive roles in constructing our ecosystems at the level of soils, at the level of sewage context, at the level of the homes in which we reside, and at the level, we wouldn't like to admit it, many of us, but many issues with our own physiologies are heavily influenced by invertebrate co-constituents of our bodies. So I recognize that we give invertebrates short shrift, but I think education, knowledge, and more direct discourse around the diversity of types of life will help us gain a recognition and an understanding of their agency in our world.
Okay, another question about interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity from Felix Remter. He writes, having worked in highly transdisciplinary research institutes for the last years, I witnessed many projects that had severe problems. People didn't understand each other as epistemologies. Suppose this is the classic problem, right? Leading to frustration on all sides. I think this is also the question a little bit that Luísa asked you earlier on. But I suppose that this viewer is asking, how can we shift to transdisciplinarity? Is the monodisciplinary academic training, as we encountered it normally, part of the problem? So how can we actually overcome this?
Yes, training is an enormous part of the problem. So I don't believe in CP Snow's two cultures. I believe that is a cultural and political artifice created by this insistence on disciplinary, on policing of disciplinary boundaries. I would argue that in our training, if we give incredible training in theory and method in a specific area, but as I said earlier, also in that training, bring together diverse groups of students and faculty or different groups of scholars that come together and actually engage in discussions from different disciplinary areas. Fostering that in young scholars means that as they mature, they have that capacity. So 3 things to do. 1, read outside of your discipline, regardless. That is always important. 2, train students to understand how to engage in conversation with others. And 3, fund projects, particularly student projects that are collaborative, and don't expect students to do everything on their own. Teams are better. Diverse research teams, inclusive research teams make for better research. The data are in, it's very clear. It makes our science better and gives us a better chance at a better future.
A capitalism question. Probably we can quote Aldo Leopold here: see land as community to which we belong rather than as a commodity belonging to us, right? And we quite often look at animals as commodities. And so many viewers ask, what can we do to strengthen the relation between animals and humans without exploitation or beyond exploitation?
We're not going to get beyond exploitation as one of the relationships. That's going to continue. But beyond exploitation in the sense of a multiplicity of relationships is possible. That's by learning of the different arrays around the planet that already engage in sustainable mutual relationships that are not exploitative in the ways that we commonly assume. But we can also do this by restructuring our politics and economies at the local levels and at community and regional levels, sort of trying to reimagine through practice our relationships to other species. This is a much longer conversation, but I think the critical thing here is that we have the capacity. There are many models out there. Exploitation need not be the main way in which we interact with others, although it is not going away. That's part of broad ecological systems, but the ways in which we engage in exploitation and the depth and the cruelty by which we do it can be mediated, modulated, and as we expand to other kinds of relationships as central ones of value.
Much of your talk focused on changing the academic environment and sort of rethinking the way that research and conservation debates are framed and sort of organized. Some of the viewers have questions about, you know, how to reach out to the larger audiences. For example, Angela writes, "Thank you, Agustín, for your amazing presentation. Besides master's and PhD programs, how can we reach the general population about this topic? How can we make people even interested in these kinds of issues? Unfortunately, there are still so many individuals who don't see the importance of this subject, and it's difficult to reinvent their ideals," she writes.
Well, most of those who are not interested are adults. Children are very interested in this. We beat it out of them with our education system. So let me just say, first off, redo our education system so it is a multi-species engagement. So we learn to understand our entanglements and our context. If you allow children to flourish, to engage, and to really experience and hold on to that interest in the world as they mature into adults, those adults will also carry it. That's one way. The second way, and I know we're just about out of time, the second way I would say change our education system, but also, again, scientists learn to speak with non-scientists outside of the academy about the amazingness of other organisms and our relationships to them. We need more engagement of the translation of academic knowledge into the world to enrich everyone's lives and to draw attention on the entanglements that we all exist in. So education and more public engagement.
Thank you so much, Agustín. I think we kind of ran out of time. I don't know if Luísa would like to ask a final question.
I don't know if we still have time, but I think many questions are about how we as humans can think about other species? I think there is many questions about this. I don't know if you want to make a
final comment.
Yeah.
Final comment is that I recommend everyone sometime in the next few days, if it is all possible, stare out a window, sit in a yard, sit on your street, look at the world, find other organisms, plant, animal, what have you, spend a few moments watching them and recognize we're all in this together. The Anthropocene is about all of us, so understanding all of us, not just the humans, is the future.
Thank you.
It's been great. Truly inspiring discussion, Agustín. Many thanks once again for your contribution to pluralizing the Anthropocene.
Thank you for having this and for inviting me. This is a great series.
Thank you so much, Agustín, and thank you the entire audience, and we'll meet again April 15.
Anyway, Agustín has called for the need for us to pay for more attention to the human-other animal interface in the Anthropocene. Humans have always lived in multi-species realities for much of their evolutionary history, but the way the global economy operates today seems to assume that humans are all alone and can do it all alone. This anthropocentrism is at the heart of the environmental uncertainties of the current era and is leading to the extinction of many species. Reverting this process of biodiversity destruction and securing the future of human life on the planet will require abandoning the modern anthropocentric attitude of we can do it all alone, and developing a new language of collaborative survival capable of acknowledging the multi-species realities that shape everyone's lives. Scientists have the responsibility to make an important contribution to this endeavor, but they have to dare to think a bit more outside the box and counter the trend towards, I suppose, the knowledge specialization. Sorry. There are more than just humans in the critical zones of the Anthropocene. And studying these more than human critical zones through the lens of Agustín's human-other animal interface and its mutual ecologies entails the development of multidisciplinary perspectives across the sciences and humanities, capable of attending to multiple layers of knowledge, but it also requires opening up the ivory tower of research and conservation debates on the Anthropocene to ethnography and the multiple perspectives on relationality, for example, to Indigenous scholars and stakeholders as core collaborators. Please join me in thanking Agustín once again for this wonderful contribution to pluralizing the Anthropocene. Before you all go, let me just remind you that the next session of Pluralizing the Anthropocene will take place on April 15th at 3 p.m. GMT, and we will be talking to Helena Freitas, the UNESCO Chair in Biodiversity and Conservation for Sustainable Development, about the need to respect nature and its limits. The event is free, but registration is required as usual. Please check the Seralv's website for more details on how to register. Many thanks once again for your support, and see you again on April 15th. Thank you.
Bye, thank you.